The Dawi, one of the oldest and proudest races in the world. Long is their history, full of pride, greed and war. For the Dwarfs are easily one of the most well-known and powerful races of the Warhammer world. Although not as old as the elven races, the Dawi once held the strongest kingdom in the world. Their cities impenetrable, their smiths and craftsmen unrivaled, their warriors fierce, and their memory unforgiving. But before we go into too much detail about their current history, let us look onto the past. In ancient days, the Warhammer world was very much different to the world that we know of today. Many ancient races struggled for control in a world which was almost inhospitable. Not much is known of this version of the world due to the coming of the beings known as the Old Ones. It was these beings which twisted and shaped the world to what we know of today. And it was these exact beings which twisted and shaped many of the races that we also know of today. One of them being the Dawi, the Dwarfs. It is said that once the Old Ones were happy with the reshaping of the world, the Dawi shortly came into existence. And with the birth of the Dawi came the birth of their gods. Ancient dwarf legends state that the Dawi were shaped from the very rock of the earth itself, and that their gods themselves created them and them alone to inherit the world. This may be why the Dawi see a sense of superiority for their people, and are very secretive towards the other races of the world, possibly unknowing that the Old Ones created and shaped them as they did many others. The Dawi, while shaped by the gods, were still not the technologically advanced race that we know of today. Indeed, this fact is mostly unknown to those not of dwarf blood, but in the early years, the Dawi were rather primitive. The early dwarves lived within cold and dark caves. They hunted and feasted on nearby vegetation, and never strayed too far from the Southlands. Little more than savages, the Dawi persisted. There were bigger predators, but the resilience of the dwarfs has been a trait of theirs since the beginning. 3 living gods stood among the Dawi: Velea, the mother of the dwarfs, and Grungi and Grimnir, the brother husbands of Velea. Speculated to be the very first of their kin, birthed from the actual stone itself, their people followed them as the true gods of the Dawi. In truth, we now know that these 3 were but simple dwarfs, whom eventually ascended to godhood in a much similar fashion to Sigmar Heldenhammer. But the Dawi retell their history a little different, for in their mind, their gods walked among them to guide them to prosperity. Velea taught them how to speak, read and write, allowing for them to record their history. Grungi taught them how to mine and shape metal and stone. Finally, Grimnir taught them the art of war. The dwarfs would learn from their gods, and slowly their empire grew. They reached out from the Southlands, exploring the mountain ranges across the known world. There they found many precious gems and metals. While many settled within these mountains, others continued. Many Dawi settled within the lands now known as the World's Edge Mountains, building the first known holds, Karaks in the dwarven language of Khazalid. Ancient underground cities, which many still hold true to this day. Other dwarf clans continued and travelled, some settling in the desolate regions of Zorn Uzkul, the Great Skull Land, and some pressed on further even still. From the lands of the south to the cold dark lands in the north, many Karaks were being built. A dwarf empire was founded, the Karaz Ankor, the Everlasting Realm, or the Mountain Realm in Dawi tongue. stood proudly above all others. For many years, the dwarfs held the strongest position within the Warhammer world. Their empire spread throughout the known reaches of the world, and despite the vast distances between the holds, communication was still somewhat strong. Trade was prominent, and any lesser races who wished to invade them were quickly met with force. The Dawi themselves lived a somewhat secluded nature, preferring to keep away from the petty dealings of the primitive humans, seeing all too well the destructive nature of those in the south known as the Nehakarans. All was right in the Kara's Ankor. Trade was well, life was booming, and many inventions were being created. But as we know, things were to change. For when the Old Ones were shaping the world, they attracted the attention of the dark powers of chaos. Yes, it is true that before the arrival of the Old Ones, the Warhammer world was destructive, but it was still untainted by the warping powers of chaos. Sensing the arrival of the Dark Gods, the Ancestor Gods began to warn their chosen people. They were told to dig deeper within the mountains, as the outside world would soon change, and they would be safer within the stone that birthed their proud race. Unfortunately, due to being secluded in their mountain holds, communications with the holds to the east and the north would be lost. Many to the east fell to darker powers, a fact which goes rather largely ignored by the greater holds, preferring to explain that they have merely died than to accept this fact. For years, the Dawi dwelt within their mountains, safe from the outside world. They dig deeper and deeper, unaware of the happenings outside. Eventually, the coming of chaos had passed, and the Ancestor Gods said it was time to open the great doors and see the changes to this world. Much to their horror, the world had suffered at the hands of the Dark Gods. Many peoples had mutated into terrifying monsters, and demons now roamed the world. In these dark times, the Dawi were worried, for the demons themselves were not of this world, and they came and went as they pleased. The Ancestor Gods sought to teach their people methods on fighting these creatures. Grungi taught them how to forge weapons and armor that would banish the monsters. Valea taught them how to ward off dark magics, and Grimnir led the mighty charge against these dark powers. One by one, the armies of each Karak sallied forth to meet the demons, mutants, and worshippers of the dark powers. Many died on both sides, but the Dawi would not be pushed back. How dare these demons seek the lands of the Karaz Ankor? The Dawi were strong, yes, but the demons were limitless, and it would seem that this war quickly had turned into a war of attrition. The Dawi would eventually find themselves spent, were it not for the discovery of the elves, another ancient race which had also been battling the demons. Kalador Dragon Tamer and his mighty host were seeking to end the Chaos incursions, but had found themselves off course within the lands ravaged by the dark powers. At first, both had seen themselves to be enemies, but the thought quickly left their minds when a large herd of beastmen had arrived. Seeing no other alternative, the Dawi and the elves fought together. This was the first time both would fight together against the forces of chaos. And surely it would not be the last. Between the strength of the dwarfs and the magics wielded by the elves, the forces of chaos were repelled, at least for now. Communications between these mighty races were now opened, and they discussed the recent happenings in the world. They had come to the conclusion that the Great Chaos Gate had opened within these lands, and as long as it stayed opened, more and more demons would pour out, and the locals would suffer mutations under the eyes of the Dark Gods. Before they could seek and close the gate, however, both races would need to return to their respective homes and prepare themselves. Before the elves took to the seas once again, they exchanged gifts with the dwarfs to symbolize their newfound friendship and willingness to defeat the dark powers together. While en route home, the dwarfs had been taken by surprise. A second chaos invasion had just begun, far stronger than the previous. Demons once again took to this world. Faced with no other alternative, the Dawi fled back to their mountain holds. Surely they could fight better within their own lands, forcing the servants of chaos to fight in a place literally crafted by dwarf hands. Many holds were attacked, and many were destroyed, much to the dismay of the Dawi. Grimnir was thrown into a rage like no other. The time of defensive measures was done. It was time for the Dawi to head out in a mighty charge and put an end to this madness. The ancestor gods wished to stop him, but the god of warriors was stubborn like any other dwarf and would not be stopped. Grimnir shaved his head, leaving only a fraction of his hair left, a trait soon adopted by the famed Slayer cult, and swore he would destroy the Chaos Hordes himself. Together with a host of fierce warriors, Grimnir charged into the lands later known as the Empire, to the foot of the Middle Mountains. Demons fell by hundreds, even thousands, and still the Dawi pressed on. Grimnir felt the horrors within the mountains, and knew that this would be his end. His warriors and his only son were with him, but he would not see them die this day. He bestowed one of his legendary weapons to his son, and commanded him and his host to return home. The horrors within the mountains would be faced by him and him alone, and he would not fail. Grimnir marched on by himself to the very opening of the Great Chaos Gate. With the fury of a living god, he slew hundreds of thousands of demons as they launched themselves at him. Meanwhile, on the Isle of Ulthuan, the elves had finished binding the magical vortex, which would stop the demonic incursions. The gates were closed, but Grimnir was never seen again. The demons began to disappear, back into the realms of their dark creators, and for a while there was peace. Around this time, the ancestor gods had also disappeared, with many Dawi believing that they had returned to the earth that had birthed them, and would one day return should their people so need them. The Dawi once again opened the doors to their mountain holds. The world was now, as they believed, safe, thanks to Grimnir, and they were now able to expand as they did long ago. A great tunnel network was created. The Undrin Ankur, the Underway, connected all dwarf holds together to increase the speed of trade, and if worse came to worse, supply reinforcements. The elves of Ulthuan at this time of safety had taken advantage to settle many colonies throughout the old world. The Dawi, still honouring their pact of friendship, began to trade with the settlers. Together, they would prosper. This age of peace would last for more than 200 years, where elf and dwarf both considered themselves friends. With the ancestor gods now gone, it fell upon the Dawi to lead themselves. Thankfully, Grungi's eldest son, Snorri Whitebeard, stayed with his kin in the old world, and took up the mantle of the first High King of the Dwarfs. He was firm but fair, a true dwarf fit to rule over his people, with his people following him without question. Snorri led many campaigns against the remnant Chaos forces, alongside the young Prince Malekith, heir to the throne of Ulthuan, of many occasions. Together, elf and dwarf shared many a battlefield, and vanquished many foes. But unknown to the dwarfs, there were some dark happenings taking place in the lands of Ulthuan, which eventually saw the mighty race of elves split and divided. This civil war saw the lands of Ulthuan sundered, with the remnants of the High Elves scrambling to regain control, and the High King's young friend, Prince Malekith, fleeing to the lands now known as Nagaroth, leading as the newly crowned Witch King of the Dark Elves. Malekith had taken control of his destiny and wished to rule as the true king of the elves, and thus he attempted to cripple the elves of Ulthuan as much as possible. We'll discuss the elves of both factions in a future series of videos, but this is an important note due to his doings then after. Malekith wished to destroy the relationship between the elves and the dwarfs, and thus sent assassins to attack dwarf caravans and trade routes. Naturally, this angered the mountain dwellers, and many of themselves prepared for war. But the High King at the time, Gotrek Starbreaker, like his predecessor, wished for open talks with the elves rather than to destroy the bonds of friendship. He sent his own cousin as a diplomatic envoy to seek for reparations for the actions of the elves, to whom, as far as he was aware, was sent from Ulthuan. There, the dwarves spoke of the crimes committed against their people and demanded gold for the lives and treasures lost. Naturally, the High Elves knew nothing of the recent happenings, as they were otherwise occupied with their civil war, and thus snubbed the dwarves. Arguments broke out which led to the shaving of the envoy's beard, a massive insult to the Dawi, for their beards are a sign of pride. The envoy was sent home with a message. If the High King wanted his gold so badly, he would need to go to Ulthuan himself and beg. The elves, despite having known the dwarves for millennia, or rather not caring about the repercussions in their arrogance, seemed to forget about the anger of the Dawi. This event became the biggest insult ever recorded within the Great Book of Grudges, which led to one of the greatest wars ever fought on the Warhammer world. High King Gotrek was understandably furious. He called upon the Dawi holds of the world to ready themselves for war. Tens of thousands of warriors stood ready under the order of the High King, ready for what was later to be called the War of Vengeance, or the War of the Beard. Without mercy, the forces of the High King laid waste to many of the High Elven colonies, destroying any who stood in their path, for the grudge needed to be settled in blood. Obviously, when word got back to Ulthuan, a host of High Elves was sent to repel the invaders. Soon enough, a full-fledged war had begun. Dawi and High Elf fought against each other, as hundreds of years of friendship was now officially dissolved. Both factions would almost destroy each other on many occasions, while the Witch King stood back and merely watched as his enemies broke upon themselves. Many new grudges were written into the Great Book, as the battles raged on and on. The son of the High King himself, Snorri Halfhand, was slain by Caledor II, which only served to anger the Dawi more. Prince Morgrin, nephew to the High King and cousin to the fallen prince, in his grief, led a rage-fueled charge against the elves, using unusual tactics, forcing the elves into close combat, where they were no match for the furious dwarfs. Morgrin led his forces to many victories, eventually slaying the elven prince, Imladric, in single combat, earning the title of Elgadum, Elfdoom, by his people, and continued his rampaging path of destruction to nearby elven cities. In other feats of strength, Brock Stonefist was given the title of Undrin Ankor Rik, Lord of the Tunnels, as he used his knowledge of the Underway to rout elven armies. His life unfortunately ended as he duelled with Lord Salador in single combat as the city of Athel Mariah burnt around them and eventually engulfed them both in flames. Years passed and still the Dawi fought on in an effort to destroy the elves. High King Gotrek pushed his forces ever forward, and on the 14th siege of Toralessi, he sought to end the war once and for all. The walls were breached, and the Dawi slaughtered all who stood in their way. Calador II stood fast and faced the mighty Dwarf King in single combat, but the elf was no match for the fury of a parent who had lost his child. Gotrek beat down his enemy to the point that the elf begged for mercy, but there was no mercy in the dwarf's eyes, only rage. Soon enough, Calador lay dead and the elves were shattered. High King Gotrek picked up the Elven King's crown and proclaimed the grudge to be settled and withdrew his forces. The crown was now his. If the elves wanted it back, they could simply come back to Karaz-a-Karak and beg for it. The war would have continued were it not for the return of Malekith, who began another invasion of Ulthuan. Many were recalled back to their homeland, while others stayed and eventually became the Wood Elves. But that is a topic for another day. With the elves now retreating, the dwarves considered the war over and proclaimed themselves to be victorious. They went back to their holds to regroup and once again ruled the old world. Little did they know a more nefarious enemy was growing in power within the shadows. For the Skaven had been growing in power, crafting various warpstone-based weaponry in order to assault the Dawi and take over the underground kingdom for themselves. The Skaven let loose a mighty machine to shatter the dwarf fortresses, and in truth they did. The shock was felt throughout the world. Many hidden tunnels and dwarf holds were damaged beyond repair. Long dormant volcanoes were now active, and the world itself was almost shattered. Such destruction would never be seen again until the end times. Naturally, a worldwide event would affect not just the world below, but the world above too. Green-skinned tribes appeared from the east, seeking shelter and a good fight in the west. Early human tribes migrated throughout the world to the lands later known as the Empire. The dwarfs, while wary of the humans, began to trade with them openly, but keeping an ever-watchful eye on them, while the greenskins were seen as a threat, and thus were attacked without mercy. Over the years, the greenskins launched many wars against the Dawi holds, taking some for themselves and twisting it into their own image. The dwarfs would retake some of the holds back, but some were lost forever. And it was then that a never-ending hatred of greenskins took over the Dawi. It was not enough that they were being invaded from above and below from this green menace, but in the chaos, the Skaven also launched many offensives. Attacked from all sides, the various kings and thanes mustered as strong as an army as they could, but eventually, sheer numbers would see many other holds lost. It is important to remember that the Dawi themselves had lost many during the War of Vengeance, and thus were not fully back into strength. All was not lost, however, for many human tribes were rising, and they were fighting the very same enemy they despised so much, so a potential alliance would see its formation. The alliance would not be formed until a while later, however, as the current reigning High King saw himself captured by orcs and goblins. But by fate, Sigmar Heldenhammer and his fierce warriors attacked the very same savages who had held the High King captive. This would begin a bond of friendship between the races that would last until the end of time itself. with High King Kurgan Ironbeard gifting the famed hammer Gal Maraz to Sigmar Heldenhammer in a sign of friendship. When one would need the other, they would answer the call. And for many, many years, Dawi and human have stood against the tides of orcs, chaos servants, Skavens and more as one. Trade between the nation of dwarfs and the newly formed empire grew, and together some peace was achieved. Many enemies rose and fell. Many Dawi holds lost and retaken. While the dwarf numbers have been dwindling over the years, for they do not reproduce as quickly as men, none can doubt the strength of the Throngs hidden within the mountains, the skill of the engineers who have built many wondrous marvels, and the sheer determination to settle grudges. The Dawi have proved themselves to be a force to be reckoned with. They have explored various reaches of the world, and have done battle with monsters that only nightmares can imagine. But still, the Dawi stand true and stand strong, for they will not be forgotten within the passage of time, and any who stand against them will be smashed down by hammer and axe. Naturally, there are a lot more things to go over with the Dawi people, and there will be many follow-up videos in the given weeks. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you all again very, very soon.